All right. Hello and welcome to the latest installment of our webinar series, COVID-19, the Roadmap to Fall 2020. Today we're talking about the online student experience, bridging academic and student affairs. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sparky Mortimer. I'm the Associate Director of Creative Strategy here at Helix Education, and I'll be moderating our webinar today. Before we get into our topic, let's go over a few housekeeping items, just so you are aware. We are recording this webinar right now. A link will be made available on our Helix Education YouTube page afterwards, so be on the lookout for that. We also are using a service called Otter AI to provide a live transcript of our webinar today. And so if you look in the chat function, if you click on that chat icon, you can find the link to that live transcript there in the chat for you to follow along as you wish. There's another button you'll see on the bottom of your screen, a Q&A button. We've already gotten a lot of questions that were submitted in advance of the webinar, so thanks to everybody who submitted questions. And so we'll have the Q&A portion in the middle of our discussion today. If there are additional questions that you have, use that Q&A function there. Again, that'll be in the middle of our conversation, and we've already got a lot of great questions for our two guests to talk about. So let's go ahead and introduce them. We are very pleased to have with us today Professor Brian Burke. Dr. Burke is an associate professor at Murray State University. He is particularly qualified to address the student affairs side of our topic today in bridging student and academic affairs. As you can see there, he's been in various editorial and advisory roles related to student affairs. You can see all those accolades right there, as well as leadership roles in the American College Personnel Association and NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education. Dr. Burke brings with him a master's degree from the University of South Carolina and a doctorate from the University of Alabama. Someone else I know who has a doctorate from the University of Alabama is our other speaker today, Dr. Shawn Happas, our Vice President and Chief Academic Officer at Helix Education. 3 decades in the industry of higher education in lots of different roles, touching student affairs, enrollment management, academic administration, working with both traditional and non-traditional students, time spent as a peer reviewer. Before joining us at Helix, she was Dean of Undergraduate Programs at Golden Gate University, and as I mentioned earlier, she too has a doctorate in higher education administration from the University of Alabama, like our other guest, Dr. Burke. So with that, Cherron, I'm going to turn the time over to you to get us started today.
Thanks, Sparky. So for those of you who have been with us the last few weeks, we are on our journey, getting ready for fall 2020. And so I wanted to share this with you today because this is just a highlight of what that journey looks like. Here we are the week of May 18th. I have to admit, I looked at the date and thought, really, is it May? I'm not quite sure what is. So thank goodness for this to keep us on track. And we're talking about the online student experience. And I'll share with you a little bit more about the 4 pillars later on in our conversation. But we really wanted to focus this conversation around the online student experience and engagement. And I think nothing demonstrates that better than if we think about and reflect on the relationship between student affairs and academic affairs. So I'm thrilled to have Brian joining me for this conversation today. So some of our goals is we want to touch base with that ever-evolving landscape in the relationship between academic affairs and student affairs. We want to talk about how important that student affairs role is for online students. Even though we've had online in our world for a long, long time, I'm not sure that we've done the best job connecting student affairs professionals and all that they bring to teaching and learning and the student experience to the table for online students. So I'm excited about that. And then we really want to think about the connection between faculty themselves, the folks that are in the classroom, albeit virtually, day by day, and how they can really bridge that for us and connect with student affairs professionals. So keep in mind those goals. We'll do a check-in at the end of the webinar and make sure that we hit them appropriately. So just some highlights of what we're going to do. We're going to do something a little bit differently today. Since I have the pleasure of having Brian join me for this conversation, that's exactly what we're going to do, is have a conversation. So not going to have a lot of slides in the middle of today's webinar. I just want to open it up. And then certainly along the way, if you have questions, please feel free to send them into the Q&A, and Sparky will jump right in and make sure that we're addressing those. One thing I did want to share, that a number of you had sent me questions about pedagogical decisions for teaching online. And we're not going to really be focusing on that at this session, but I love your questions, things around performance art and labs and those kinds of things. So I am definitely going to make sure that it gets into the future webinar agenda so we can really explore some of those things and think about how we can creatively deliver a curriculum and the learning experience to our students when we're teaching subjects that our first response is, yeah, you can't teach that online. Let's figure out if we can. And then we'll talk about the 4 pillars of quality online education that Helix has developed and how we can help. So that's our plan for today, and thank you again for joining us. So unprecedented circumstances. Oh, and I had intended to drop a graphic in there, so we're just going to look at it real quick. Our friends at the Chronicle of Higher Education are tracking lists of colleges' plans for reopening. And at this point, I'm sure most of you are aware that the California State University system has declared that they're going to go fully online. They are the largest public system in the United States, and I think are going to set a precedent. We've seen all kinds of things in the last couple of days. We've got those proposing a hybrid model, moving away from a fall break, planning to have everything closed by Thanksgiving. Although I'm not sure that the COVID virus follows a calendar the way we'd like it to, people are certainly thinking about how to make adjustments. Lots and lots of opportunities and a range of scenarios. Folks still waiting to decide. We're hearing a lot about June 15th or July 1 for final decisions to be made. And then there are the stalwart believers, those who think that we're going to be in person for this fall term and are preparing to move that direction. And for those of you that are following this like I am, you know that for many of our colleagues, particularly at small to mid-sized private independent institutions, it is almost an imperative that they be able to open this fall because of the financial consequences of not having a fully robust online environment. So these are all things that we're watching, and I hope that you all know. I'll share an email with you at the end of the presentation, but if there are things that it would be helpful for us to continue to address in these sessions, please let us know and we will add them to the agenda. I've shared this before, and this is really thinking about how we've transitioned from the world as we know it to what might become in front of us. And this is a great graphic from Phil on EdTech. And I think as we really think about phase 3, sitting in this moment of the what if and how do we decide to do the things that we need to do, I think this is really where the rich conversations about how do we think about instructional design as preparing us for whatever may come. And what Brian and I will talk about today is how do we think about student affairs, student activities, engagement, student support services, fully engaged in an online environment that continues our students on progress towards their graduation. So one of the real concepts around all of this is the idea that what we did in March was really about a fast move to remote emergency teaching. And where we really need to think about going is this idea of a quality online learning experience. And I use experience very carefully because it really is about that holistic approach. I think regardless of what institutions decide to do or end up doing when the fall rolls around, this dynamic has taught us to think about contingency planning in a very different way. So whether we are all in a position for business as usual come August or not, I think this is going to be very much something that's in the back of our minds as administrators and as faculty to think about the what could come next and how are we sure to prepare for it. And that's why we really feel like the pathway that we're taking in these discussions is so critical right now. So the bridging academic and student affairs. And I'm gonna open up or stop sharing and just open it up to a conversation with my good friend and colleague, Brian. So welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you online with us.
Cherron, I'm so thrilled to be part of this conversation.
You know, one of the things that prompted me to think about you being the right person for us to connect with around this is just your passion for student affairs and really for making sure that every student is brought along successfully. So tell us a little bit about some of your recent activity and what brought you to really think about, wow, we've got to bridge this connection.
So I think what's gotten me thinking this connection is my own experience as a faculty member teaching online. So I started teaching online in 2011 out of necessity. I had students who needed a summer class, but I was getting married that summer. And I needed to figure out how to still deliver that high quality course content with an engaging experience, but still leave time for all that wedding prep and a honeymoon, and then, you know, whatever happens in life as you first get married. And so I jumped into our LMS at my institution and put some stuff together. I had no background, no training. I had taken one online course in my doc program, and that was my exposure. I did some reading about online teaching, really looked up what could I dig into quickly to get a handle on asynchronous teaching, and create an experience that, lo and behold, the students valued. And so then as I got opportunities to engage in some formal learning a couple years later, and was able to participate in an online teaching certificate, I started to realize, okay, there's something to this, and it's not about the technology, but it's about pedagogy. But then beyond that, it's about connections with students. And as I reflected on that first teaching experience, even though I was busy with wedding prep and honeymooning and all that good stuff, I was still checking in with the students. I didn't just put content out there and say, hey, see you in 8 weeks, can't wait to read your final paper.
Yeah.
To me, that's what student affairs is that touch point, that checking in, that there's someone beyond my faculty member that I know I can go to. And I think when it comes to the online experience, a lot of our institutions don't do a really strong job of reinforcing that as a connection point for students. And I previously worked in residence life, and so that was day in, day out, living with students, and just informally, hey, how's everything going? Or I thought you had a 4-hour lab today. Is something, and you're not there right now. What's going on? Are you okay? And I think some faculty do a really good job of picking up cues in online courses, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. There are a lot of cues that faculty are able to pick up on. And those that aren't, they probably aren't good at that in person either.
And I want to circle back around about those cues too in just a bit. But
yeah.
One of the things as we were prepping for this, Brian, that you said to me that just struck a chord was this idea that today's world of online is really hearkening back to where higher ed was in the 19th century in terms of the role of the faculty. I'd love for you to share that with our audience, because I think that really is an important point.
Sure. So I think what a lot of folks may not realize, one, if you're a faculty member and you have some familiarity with student affairs existing on your campus, then kudos to you. I'm really proud of you, because so many of my faculty colleagues have no clue that student affairs even exists. And I think that's because we're in a place as faculty where we're really able to focus in on what we choose to focus in on, whether that's our teaching, our research, our service, a blend of those things. A lot of that varies based on institutional context. And our ability to focus on those things is thanks to student affairs. So what a lot of folks probably don't know or don't realize is that the student affairs profession is relatively young compared to the age of higher education. Whether we're talking about higher education in this country, which originated with the founding of Harvard in 1636, or go back to the Middle Ages and the founding, the first sparks of universities in medieval monasteries. Well, before 1917, so I say 1917 because I think about a profession being defined by some sort of credential. And so the first master's degree in what we would now consider to be student affairs practice was awarded in 1917 at Columbia Teachers College. So for a little more than 100 years, we've had a formal field marked by professional training. So that came about because the role of the faculty was shifting in the late 19th century. Prior to that time, faculty were responsible for every element of students' lives. Not only were they in the classroom with students and in labs, They were in the residence halls with them. They were in the dining halls, not just eating, but monitoring. Faculty were responsible for student conduct issues. They were responsible for trying to keep wraps on these weird underground groups that some of them used Greek letters and they called themselves literary societies. And so this burgeoning, what we now know as Greek life. So the faculty role was very different. In the 19th century, until about 1889 or so, institutions generally had a single administrator, and that was the president. And then around
sorry,
1890, we got our first dean of men at Harvard. And then a few years later, we got our first dean of women at the University of Chicago. And so we're really still talking in the last 125 years, we've had at a minimum one staff member dedicated to taking some of that burden off of faculty's lives.
Well, now we understand why we talk about administrative bloat, right? When you think
That's
about how
true.
much all that's grown in 125 years. And I love the thought of returning faculty back to center. We often talk about it when we're doing instructional design with our partners that for online students, there is the reality that the only thing that they know about or connect to your physical campus is what they experience through the course design, which is why it's so important to put your best foot forward. But this idea of not only is it about the overall structure and experience within the online course, but it's also about the human touch that they connect with as well. So I really enjoy that, but I do, after lots of years of being on college campuses and many of those years in student affairs myself, I do understand that disconnect or that sense of us versus them between faculty and between student affairs. And I'd love to get some of your thoughts about how would you imagine student affairs being more integrated, particularly in an online environment and in the circumstances that we're facing right now?
So when I think about the online environment and in the context of the type of work that Helix Education does and the services that y'all provide to institutions, I think about that for asynchronous programs and in that lens for online learners. It's got to start at the very beginning with an orientation experience. That gets overlooked so often for online programs because there's this mindset that, well, the online learner, particularly in these asynchronous programs, they're generally working adults. They don't want all that fluff, all that extra stuff. We used to say that about commuter students too.
Right.
In the 80s and 90s. I went to a commuter institution for undergrad. Let me tell you, commuters, regardless of age or generation, they wanted that connection. They wanted the experience.
Yeah.
So we make a lot of assumptions that are probably not terribly accurate.
Yeah.
About the students that we serve. So we've got to start with that orientation piece. And that's an opportunity to highlight to students, here are these other connection points for the institution. We need to make some other things beyond orientation standard in the LMS for every course. We probably provide information about tech support.
Yeah.
Or the information for the bookstore. And we're going to provide that phone number and that URL for the bookstore's website. Hopefully, we're starting to provide information about mental health support and those available resources. We probably provide some standard stuff around utilizing the writing center on campus and some of those others really true support mechanisms. But what about those other experiential pieces? We need to think about how do we help students, one, just develop an awareness that there are these other things on a university's campus that are available, whether you are physically on that campus or engaging with the institution digitally.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up mental health services, because I know that long before COVID, this was something that was rightfully so and importantly so moving to the forefront of the conversation. And one of our viewers today sent in a question that says, given the pre-COVID-19 gap between mental or emotional health services available to online students compared to their campus counterparts, how should institutions best manage the need for this type of support in the virtual space? And I'd love to, Brian, are you seeing trends around this or efforts being made around this?
I don't know if I'm seeing trends. I'm seeing efforts, and I'm seeing some efforts hit with some mixed results.
Okay.
So some institutions are very concerned about HIPAA compliance for any sort of digital connection.
Mm-hmm.
Um, from my limited understanding, we see the same thing with telehealth. So a counseling center would use telehealth options because they have the highest level of security. Once there's a peer-to-peer connection made, no one else can get into that virtual space. Unfortunately, those solutions do come with a cost.
Mm-hmm.
And the platform that we're on today does have some HIPAA compliant options available.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that I've experienced in student affairs, not just specific to mental health, but just thinking about possibilities, is we're very quick to say or to assume that's going to take extra financial resources. We just don't have that.
Yeah.
Why am I going to waste my time trying to find that information? It's just going to get denied. So one that I worry about is we often get into a self-defeatist mindset.
Yeah.
But let's do our homework. What is available? Does the institution have a partnership with the local health provider, and that health provider uses telehealth?
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can expand that partnership to include our own counseling services, or even counseling services within the surrounding community?
Yeah.
So that we can have more robust provision of mental health services for online learners. Because that's something I've heard from folks across the country, is the online students just don't feel like they have the access to the same resources. And a lot of that's sometimes because the institution has a very on-ground mindset
Mm-hmm.
for services.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to the assumption that online learners don't have these extra interests, whatever that extra gets defined as.
Yeah. 100 years ago when student affairs reported to me at Golden Gate, so that institution's been working with online students since the late 1990s. So long before some of these technologies were available, we were kind of winging it. We knew how to deliver curriculum, but the services piece could be a challenge. And I know it was an interesting strategy, but we set up our counseling team simply to be able to develop referral structures. We knew from our student database where the vast majority of our students resided. And so we began to reach out to public health opportunities, sliding scale mental health services, and that kind of thing. So when a student called us from Sacramento or Southern California, we could at least, if not provide the service, provide them the guidance to find those kinds of services. So I also think that some old school practices around this stuff could help too, for sure.
Yeah, my very first graduate assistantship as a master's student was putting together resource books, and it included on-campus and off-campus resources.
Yeah.
And I think we've lost sight of that very basic type of thing. I think we assume that everybody's going to understand how to do a web search for something that they need and be able to pinpoint either something on campus or in the local community.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. So as we think about some of these challenges, and I think our tendency in the modern age is to always go for this high-tech stuff. There are also some things that we just struggle to do because there are barriers, either culturally or technologically or whatever there might be. What do you, in this space right now, perceive as barriers for bridging that connection between student affairs and academic affairs?
I think a lot of it goes back to lack of knowledge. And I'm not going to put that all on faculty.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people who work in the non-academic side, which I got a big picture label as student affairs, who really understand the faculty life.
Yeah.
I think they see folks who have limited office hours. They perceive the faculty roll in and teach their class and then leave campus and go do who knows what. But I think there's a lack of understanding. I think there's a lack of understanding, kind of building on that in terms of the faculty perspective on the tenure track. And what does that look like for that specific institution?
Yeah.
Some places, the expectation, of course, is just voluminous research contributions. Some places have a really high service expectation.
Yeah.
So that means that student affairs educators need to learn about their own institution. And that's the advice that I've given to folks even before I became a faculty member.
Yeah.
Learn about where you work, learn the history of the institution, and learn what you can about the culture as quickly as you can. Because there's some things about an institutional culture you only learn by living it.
Yeah.
But there's some bits and pieces that we can pick up on pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things I count as a major blessing in my career, is that I spent so many years of it in small, private, independent institutions where everybody wears multiple hats and you have great opportunities. I've told people I've done everything except the bursar and the president, I think, at this point. But with that, I agree with you completely. I think having a holistic understanding of the roles and the contributions that each of the administrative and faculty silos that tend to happen, but what value each of them brings to the table. And it really does take staff understanding exactly what the load is on faculty and what their role is. And I think the other side of it too is it takes faculty to recognize there are support systems and structures to help them help students, and that there are places to go. They're not just the other or just the party people, right? There's a lot more to it than that in a student affairs organization.
Yeah, and that's something I've encountered in my faculty life as I meet faculty from other departments and the institutions where I've worked, and they ask, "Oh, so what do you teach?" I say, "Oh, I teach higher education and student affairs." And like, "Wait, what is that?" And that's an opportunity to try to, okay, in the 3 minutes that we're both waiting for the school bus to get our kids, what is the field?
Yeah.
And so I often frame it as, "Hey, you know that really big event that was on the quad last week? Yeah, that was so cool. Student affairs did that. But here are the other things student affairs does too." At Murray State, we have a very robust residential college system. And the way it's structured is that every member of the campus community is assigned to a residential college. And there are lots of different opportunities to choose what that engagement looks like. But at a minimum, faculty know that those things exist, and the residential colleges exist beyond the academic realm. So that's a great starting point for that conversation for us.
Yeah.
So my advice is at each institution, not everybody has a residential college system, but what's that thing? What's the bridge? What's the connection point? And to me, I think that's one of the big things to think about when I think about the connection point between the academic side and the student affairs side as an individual faculty member. We, as the folks who work with online learning at institutions, need to help faculty members recognize what are the connection points.
Mm-hmm.
So not just for me as a faculty member, but for the students that I work with, for the students in my classes. If I have a student who is expressing, maybe it's not a mental health issue, but it's one of those things where as a student affairs person, I would probably refer them to the Multicultural Student Center, or I'd refer them to the Office of Student Involvement. And a lot of that can take place as we onboard new faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been a faculty member at this, my third institution, and I've went through faculty orientation at two of them. One institution, the faculty orientation was about benefits. And that was kind of the long and short of it. The Murray State, the other institution, had a very robust faculty orientation process. And it was not just about, here's orientation, it's a one and done. It was about building community and an onboarding process.
I love it. I love it. That's great. And probably something that we miss, right? We think about from a staff perspective, onboarding for training and all of that, but you're right. The campus culture is the lifeblood of that institution. It's where the mission and the values play out. So why not invest that time as you're bringing people in to really understand that full campus culture environment? So that's really exciting. If you could think about top 3 things you'd like to tell the student affairs universe today, to ways to think about how to connect and be a part of this online community, what might those top 3 things be?
That's a good question. I'd love top 3 lists or top 10. I think about late night with Letterman or the Late Show. So from the student affairs perspective, so for those folks who are working in the field, looking for proper opportunities to bridge the connection with faculty, tell your story on campus. Don't assume that everybody on campus knows what you do. Tell your story and get creative in how that story gets told. Because I think all too often, so you mentioned earlier that we get into our silos. Sometimes that siloed approach turns into competing for resources. Whether that's true competition or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of budget cuts during my time in higher education. I've seen a few moments that looked like prosperity, but they were quick.
Right.
But regardless, it always seemed as though there was a sense of competition, but the sense seemed to be coming from within each silo. I didn't get a sense that it was coming from upper administration or the state or anything like that.
Yeah.
So tell the story of what you do. What is it that, not just in terms of here's the bullet list of the things I do in my job, but what's the impact that you make on students' lives? So that's number 1, tell your story. And then number 2 is related to that. Celebrate your successes. Toot your own horn. This is something that I've pushed for every place I've worked.
Yeah.
Is no one else is going to celebrate your wins unless you tell them about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we need to put ourselves out there.
Yeah.
And I still identify as a student affairs educator. Maybe it's because that's the field I teach in, but we have to tell people when we do something that's awesome.
Yeah. And there's a lot of awesome stuff that happens. But I think to that point, one of our attendees sent in a note about this, and it says, there have been a lot of questions at my institution prior to COVID on how student affairs can offer their service to our growing online population. I think the emphasis has been on the student activities side. Is this something that's being done, or is it more of a focus on other services?
I think the focus has been on service provision. And not as much on the experiential piece, which is what I think of as student activities. I think it should be both.
Yep.
And I thought that for a while. I wasn't really sure what that looked like. I have a lot of friends and colleagues who work in campus activities. And the conversation that we've had over the last several years is, what does campus activities look like online?
Yeah.
And then once all the COVID stuff started hitting, some of those folks in campus activities are actually like speakers and performers. You know what? They know how to work Zoom. We can still have programs that take place via digital means.
Yeah.
We can still have a leadership development program that can take place from a distance. We can have opportunities for connection. Yeah. So one of the things that I would love to see is, and some institutions have started to look at started to explore this, as an online student union. And I think sometimes we think about the union just as that building that sometimes houses offices that provide the services. But I think about a union in terms of around 1900, when they were first coming to fruition. The idea was that the student union would be the institution's living room. So the students are off living in their dorms. Sorry if there's any residence life people, residence halls. Don't want to get blasted for the D word there. And then, but I mean, that's what the space was for. The library was for studying. The union would be the living room. Well, what's a living room? It's a place to connect and to converse and to get to know people. Yeah. And so I think there's so much opportunity that with the technology that we have, and it doesn't have to be big and glitzy. It can be basic, but it can be just, there can be a variety of entry points to help students connect. And those connections can be synchronous or asynchronous. And
And
I saw in the
so,
chat that
oh,
I've only listed 2 so far, and you
I
asked me my
know, I
top
caught
3.
that too. I promised Patty we'd circle back around. So what's your third?
So let's see. I said we got to tell our story. We've got to celebrate our wins. And I think the third one should probably be the first one, and that's get out from behind our desks
Mm,
and go connect with faculty.
yeah.
Because so when I went through my master's program, there was every 8 to 10 years we get this kind of big flurry of how do we bridge student affairs and academic affairs, and then we get a pretty cantankerous response that they don't get us,
Yeah.
we can't get along, let's just call the whole thing off. I think, again, at some point, as the student affairs folks, we just need to suck it up and go make the connections.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I've always been a little sad about, probably the best way to put it, is that I don't know that the conversations start with the one thing that we have in common as faculty and as student affairs professionals, and that is learning and development of our students at whatever age, whatever stage it might be. All of us have gotten into this work because we want to be a part of helping them gain knowledge, gain experience, and advance themselves in whatever that shape or form that may look like. And so I often think, what if we could frame a conversation around our objective connected to teaching and learning and find that shared opportunity to really bridge some of that gap?
I think that's it's so common sense. Why don't we do that?
Yeah.
Because as a field, as a profession, we have a theoretical base to guide the work of student affairs.
Yeah.
And that theoretical base is all about helping students learn and grow through their experience in college.
Yeah.
It's not age bound. It's not place bound. It's about meeting students where they are and helping them advance to whatever the next level is.
Yeah.
And isn't that what we do in teaching?
Yeah.
In the classroom. And so that the learning outside the classroom looks and feels a little bit different, but we have professionals who have credentials, degrees, and experience in doing just that. It's just a little bit different context than what we see inside the classroom.
So Brian, this question is going to be, oh, hold on just a second. Somebody said it's also because a lot of offices are decentralized and we tend to get siloed. I do agree student affairs professionals need to make the first step because faculty have no incentive to do so. And I would have to agree with you, Kevin, because this all goes back to what are our reward structures around promotion tenure and the work of contingent faculty and how we stretch them as thin as possible. So I agree there.
Yeah.
How do we COVIDize student relations when they return to campus? I think you want to trademark that one, COVIDize, Gary. That's awesome. What do you think about that, Brian?
I think that's what institutions are trying to figure out right now.
Yeah.
With developing a menu of options. So I think about the graphic that you shared from the Chronicle to start off with the pie chart. And I'm interested, and as I've looked at some of those lists, so that same Chronicle article, I think, links to the ever-growing list of institution decisions. I mean, 68% are saying that they're going to be happening in person.
Yeah.
I know folks who are at institutions that have made that type of declaration. And at least in the case of the publics, particularly regional comprehensives, they're really evaluating a menu of options where some form of in-person is going to be the main approach.
Yep.
But it's likely going to include, like I said, a menu.
Yeah.
So how do we COVIDize the student piece? That's gonna be tough. Yeah. Because right now the guidance on reopening, at least in the 3 phases, based on the playbook from the White House that all 50 states are basing their plans off of, and then in turn institutions are, as we step down the line there, we're all basing things off those three phases.
Yeah.
And with each phase reflecting a lower degree of restriction. Phase 1 and phase 2 both include very limited, if not completely restricted, interactions in communal spaces.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for our physical student unions? What does that mean for dining halls?
Yep.
I anticipate a lot of food services are going to be grab and go.
Yeah.
And what I'm really, particularly as a former housing professional, what are we going to do in residence halls?
Yeah.
We have a lot of campuses that are actually busting at the seams. They don't have extra bed space. So how do we spread folks out?
Yeah, and I think this is really where those community connections become vital for resources and options of ways to do that. I don't envy the role of the college president in today's environment at all. It's just so much. And you know, so David just asked, I understand social distancing on campus. What about washrooms, right? I think the reality of it is in today's space, we know less than we know for sure. And I think that this is where creating a culture of kindness and respect for one another. And there's going to be some folks that are scared and some folks that aren't, but really helping them to find their place that they can be comfortable. Carly, I'm trying to get to that Q&A. Sparky, can you help me with that Q&A question? Because it's not coming up for me.
Sure, that's all right. So I've got a question from Abe. Abe is saying, having student affairs folks keeping in touch with the students is seen as a best practice. However, faculty engagement with students is also equally important. There can be a tendency by faculty not to engage as much when there's another person, meaning student affairs, doing the engagement. So how do we strike that balance?
That's a great question. So from research, we know that what really lends itself to increased retention rates and then increased graduation rates and reduced time to graduation is high quality faculty to student connection, particularly out of class. And so that could be working in a research lab with a professor outside of a formal class requirement. The type of campus atmosphere where if you pass your professor on the sidewalk, you can stop and chat informally. Those are the things that have a huge impact.
Yeah.
Now we do see from research, so I say impact. So I think about the work of George Koo around high impact practices,
Yep.
and that in research from the NSSE, National Survey for Student Engagement, and the Community College Survey for Student Engagement, and the Faculty Survey of Student Engagement. So those three pieces that come out of Indiana University Center for Student Engagement, it's a statistically significant impact.
Yeah.
There are other impacts that show strong statistical measures and show strong. There's a probably good chance it's a good predictor of student success, and that's the student affairs connection.
Yeah.
It's just not as statistically significant as the faculty piece. But the question is, if faculty make that assumption that there's somebody else doing it, my recommendation is we have to think about what is it in the institutional culture that's driving that mindset. Has there been communication that's either, and it may not even be explicit communication, that leads the faculty member to think, you know what, there's a whole nother division of this institution that deals with that student connection.
Yeah.
That allows me to just focus on the student performance in my class.
Yeah.
So we have to remind faculty to humanize that class experience. So if for example, I made the connection earlier, that if I see that a student is doing so well in my class or something's going on, or when I worked in residence life, hey, I thought you had a 4 o'clock lab right now. What's going on with you? I would hope faculty would do that same thing and make that connection. And this is something I try to get our faculty to think about with online teaching. It's not about putting your content out there, but it's about connecting with folks.
Yes. Well, and Brian, I'll share a little bit more about some of the stuff that Helix has for tools that are available for folks on our website that we've built around the new future. But, one of the things that we really embrace is an idea of coaching as a supporting infrastructure underlying. And I know some campuses call them care teams. It's been very successful in the online environment to think about from that point that you enroll to graduation, that you have a single point of contact, that if you get stuck in whatever your stuck might be, that you've got somebody who's reaching out to you regularly. And I think where I've seen these models be most successful is when it's in true partnership, right? That it's not a student comes to the coach and says, oh, Brian gave me a bad grade on my test, right? That may be the response from the student, but I think when the real partnership is there is when the coach says, have you had a conversation with your professor? Have you gone to the tutoring center, right? And encourages that connection. And then is also a follow-up, because those coaches are going to be equipped in a way that their world is around that. And while you might not always as a faculty member be able to connect regularly with those students, there's a full infrastructure and this idea of a catch net underneath students that really takes everybody in the campus community to be a part of. So I love that idea about when it all comes down to it, the most success comes from intentional engagement and relationships, whether it's faculty to student, whether it's student affairs to faculty, that's really where the benefit comes in. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I really, to me, that's my whole thing too. In fact, I was having a conversation with a faculty member last week who had come to some sessions I'd done on our campus through our faculty development center. And I always talk about that connection piece. And she said, you know what, honestly, I felt a little intimidated because it seems like you invest so much time in the engagement. And I said, well, I'm able to, just in the way that I approach my course design process.
Yes. All right. Well, Brian, thank you so much. We're coming to closer to the top of the hour, but I would like to take a few minutes and share the tools that we have available for the higher ed world at large. We really felt like this was such a critical time in higher education. And, Helix has been supporting online students and adult students for nearly 30 years. And with that, we've got a lot of experience in what works and also what doesn't. And we want to save our colleagues throughout the United States some of that pain. So we put together what we're calling the 4 pillars, and I'll share that URL with you in just a bit. But the idea of it is that each one of these pillars is going to address a specific aspect of being prepared for a more online than not environment for your institution. Thinking about things like operationally, policy-wise, practice-wise, is your institution ready to be more online? All of our great conversations around pedagogy and teaching and learning and the tools that we have for that are available. And then also with the online student experience, we really want to let you all know that our coaching model and framework is available to you. And I'll talk with you a little bit more about that in detail. And then coming next week is setting expectation and communication for both the students and the parents, and closing that loop on what folks know or don't know at this point in their transparency. So how can we help? We've put together this set of tools, information, all available to you, all really kind of born from our experience in this field. And very much we want you all to have access to that and take advantage of it. So with that, in each one of those 4 pillars, we put together a number of tools for you to help accelerate. We know that time is of the essence at this point. And so as we think about the content of each one of those pillars, specifically thinking about this online student experience and engagement, what we want to do is make sure that we share with you our coaching model. And I think, Brian, you'll agree with me, you probably spend a lot of time in your life talking about life issues and education issues and career issues for your students, no matter where they are in the path. And we've really found that by having this infrastructure and how we think about coaching and supporting students, building that rapport that's so essential, asking those powerful questions, not being afraid of pushing students a little bit to really think critically about their circumstance and their solutions for that, and then supporting them to make sure that they get access to the things that they need to while they're empowered to be successful and to be successful taking advantage of all the resources that you have. So our RISE model is one of the tools that's available. We have both a how-to guide and some rubrics and training around using that. These are the same tools that we use internally as we work with our staff. And you can find all of this if you visit our website, helixeducation.com/new. Don't forget the little dash future. And all of the pillars are available. We also have webinars and podcasts. Brian's a guest of one of our podcasts that should be out very shortly as well. Lots of professional development opportunities. But at the end of the day, all of these tools in and of themselves can only do so much. So we encourage you, if you want to continue this conversation, if you've got additional questions about any of the tools, or if there are things that we can help you with, please feel free to write newfutureinfo@helixeducation.com. The email will come into a group of us, and we're going to spend some time figuring out who the right resource is within Helix to help you all out and answer that question. So that's definitely available to you. This is our full journey. I showed you earlier the highlight of what we're doing the week of May 18th, and you can see we will be circling back around on these topics, and it is our intention to continue these throughout the summer. And so please, if there are things that you need us to explore further, additional conversations you'd like to be a part of, drop a line to that New Future email, and we will be sure to ramp things up, whether it's a webinar or a podcast or materials to help support you in that venture. So checking in on our goals, I hope that you felt like we delivered on what we promised to today. I know that this is an important conversation and one that's really in its infancy in a number of ways. And so for those of you that are in student affairs, I look forward to watching you kind of shake your own paradigm and think about how we can connect, create community, and really engage with our students from afar, and also to create relationships with our faculty to ensure that students really are getting that full support of everything that we have to offer. So Brian, any last words or comments from you?
No, just to echo what you just said, I'm really excited to see what the future of student affairs looks like.
Yes.
As more and more folks really think critically about connecting the work of student affairs to online learners.
Well, again, let's do one quick check. Sparky, any last minute questions or comments come in?
We had a question just come in. It says, what would you suggest going to a syllabus to connect students with student affairs services? So how could faculty members leverage that kind of information in a syllabus?
I think it depends on the institution, and both the institutional and local context and the student profile. And hopefully we're able to connect with our division of student affairs or dean of students, whatever the structure is, for some guidance on some common language that can be provided. Maybe it's information around food insecurity and the on-campus food pantry, if that's available. If there are emergency housing options available for students to be able to address housing insecurity. So I think a lot of that, it varies based on, again, those very distinct contexts. But that should be a conversation that's had with the division and with leadership and staff across those different areas.
I would also offer that even beyond the syllabus, this might be a great time to think about leveraging some of that technology that we have available. So one of our attendees prior to the webinar sent us some questions and provided some insight about what she's doing on her campus with a success coach model, much like we just talked about. And one of the things that she's working on doing with her design and course build team is to create kind of a click here for help, but having it be around more of the coaching support than what you might imagine with IT, and thinking about what that infrastructure should look like. I think there's also some ways to think about some of the AI tools. Your campus may have some of that AI chat with me at the front end for admissions. What if we were to start thinking about a knowledge base that could support AI, but more delivered to continuing students and the services that are available on campus, right? So this is really a great time to get creative and think beyond the syllabus. So
if I were to guess what the future looks like, I think that the leveraging of AI to connect students with some very quick knowledge base, kind of database type of responses through chatbots.
Yeah, I think there's some great opportunity. So please, again, if you have additional questions, let me just bring up that URL and the email address again. Whoop, wrong direction. I hate it when the buttons don't play nicely. Hold on one second. We'll bring that back up for you. So again, that's helixeducation.com/new_future or newfutureinfo@helix.com. So please feel free to reach out to us. I will certainly bring Brian into the conversation again if you've got questions for him. And also if there's other things that you'd like for us to talk about in these sessions, know that we are open to learning more from you and to carrying on the conversation. So thank you, everyone. Have a great Memorial Day weekend and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.